Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Lamentations.
My friends, Lamentations is brutal. It's not a fun, enjoyable romp. It's not something that gives you a bunch of optimism and hope. It is exactly what the name promises. It is a deep dive into the deepest pits of human grief. It's a tough read, even 2,500 years removed. You can sense that the pain that is being written about and experienced by whoever wrote this, it was probably Jeremiah, but we don't know for sure. The book is technically anonymous. That pain is unprecedented for them. This is unprecedented for anybody. There's no cultural memory of the kind of pain that is being collectively felt as the circumstances that prompt the writing of this book. It's disorienting. Everything about the world is flipped on its head and then smashed with a hammer. It feels like hope and morality and everything that you would use to orient yourself in time and space and meaning and culture and language and faith and God, all of it is wrecked in one fell swoop, in one horrible calamity. Now, the calamity that we're talking about, if you've been with me through this series, it keeps coming up because the Bible keeps talking about it, because indeed it's a gigantic catastrophe. It's the conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah and its capital city, Jerusalem, at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian. And it's kind of a wild way to express this kind of withering, disorienting grief, because instead of just listing out a bunch of grievances or having a bunch of intellectual debates like what we get when we see Job dealing with grief, instead we just get 5 poems here. 5 poems. They each tackle a different aspect of this grief, and each poem covers one of the 5 chapters of Lamentations. If this was written by Jeremiah, it's a pretty bitter pill for him. If you're Jeremiah, think about your life. You not only had to write down that this is what was coming, but everybody hated you for writing it down. You experienced physical persecution. You were on the run because you said these things God wanted you to say. Then it happens. So you're in the city watching the Babylonians roll up on the city. You're in the city for the miserable siege, which includes details like parents eating their kids. I told you it was dark. So you live through that. You see the bloodshed. You see what happens finally in any siege, and this one would be the same, I imagine, when the walls finally break and the pent-up anger and frustration and lust for blood and vengeance and indulgence that would happen on the part of the people who've been stuck outside those walls as you stubbornly hold out in there, as that stuff all finally is let loose upon what's left of your weakened city when the walls break. That moment across all of history when the walls finally get broken down in a siege is historically perhaps the worst moment of human behavior across the centuries. People revert to something terribly, terribly, frighteningly zombie-like and primal in that moment. And if you're Jeremiah, you were on the receiving end. But if you're Jeremiah, you're not just watching that happen to any random city and thinking, oh, people can be really bad. You're watching that happen to your people. You're watching that happen to your city. You're watching that happen to the temple where God lives, who told you to say this stuff in the first place. Then when that initial brutal wave of terror is over, now if you're Jeremiah, you get to look at this city that was once resplendent and now it's just empty. It's wrecked. It's ruined. You're never going to see this thing put back together, at least in your lifetime. My point is, there's something to lament here, and it's not a normal lamentation. I'm not trying to make light of the things that have broken your heart, my friends. I don't want to make light of the things that have broken my heart. My heart hurts about stuff deeply. I have known loss, painful loss. I'm going to know more. It kills me to know that I'm going to know more loss. But this is life, and I know you've hurt. I know you've victimized and have regret. I know you have been victimized and feel all kinds of hurt over that. And as much as I think we have collegiality with Jeremiah in our grief, I also think we need to acknowledge that this is a unique grief that goes beyond one lifetime. This is a grief of the loss of an era, an epoch. 500 years this kingdom and this city has stood. Boom, gone. For more than that, there's been a tabernacle or a temple where God dwells with these people, and the priests carry out the sacrifices, and the relationship between God and man, though weird at times and busted up at times, it persisted through all of this. That is over. The line of David, to whom God has promised this great king who bears the title of Redeemer, who's supposed to come. Now the line of David is gone. The streets are empty. It's ruined. It looks like everything is wrecked. Everything in the short term, near term about your life, what you know, but also there's this broader cultural grief that extends all the way out even to the question of, is the whole redemptive plan of God even going to come through? And Jeremiah feels every single level of that. If it wasn't Jeremiah personally who put pen to paper to write these poems, then whoever is writing these poems had access to everything that Jeremiah wrote, and he can easily see it through Jeremiah's lenses. Either way, that pain is communicated viscerally in each of these chapters. In the first one, we get this scene of a woman in grief. The woman is a metaphor almost for grief, and the images are haunting just of Jerusalem after the siege, wrecked, gone, everything's emptied out. There was a gigantic scare that affected, well, kind of everybody not too long ago. And this really cool town near where I live called Deadwood that was always hustling and bustling, just completely emptied out. And I've got video of my phone driving through that town, not a soul in sight. And there are just deer that are walking up and down the road looking for little scraps to eat. It looked like something out of a zombie apocalypse show. And I go back and I think of that moment and of that video often because it jarred me to think about really how temporal, how fragile all these things that seem like they're never going anywhere actually are. That's the tone of what's captured in the first chapter of Jeremiah. In the second chapter, the author seems to be saying, look, there were terms to this deal. I'm your God, you're my people, and everybody's going to know it whether you obey me or not, because if you obey me, I'm going to bless you, and if you disobey me, I'm going to punish you. Well, the author acknowledges you were right to do this. We were wrong, but also I still hate it. Paraphrase is mine, but the author never even for a second indicates that like, oh, I should probably feel bad. I'm sorry. Like, I want to like the judgment that you brought upon us. I really should. No. The author seems to assume that it's absolutely fine for him to hate it, to hate the way this feels, to be absolutely bereaved, even justified in articulating his grief and disorientation, even anger, if you will, over what has happened. Chapter 3 is the centerpiece of the whole book, though. Here you get another invented literary character who is created to say that he's heartbroken, that he's crushed, that this is indeed righteous judgment from God. But there's an interesting twist in the middle here where the poet seems to be saying, well, if God did exactly what he said he was going to do in punishing us for violating his covenant, then he'll probably also do exactly what he said he was going to do, even if I can't picture how, in delivering and still redeeming, again, even though the pathway for that doesn't seem obvious to me as the poet anymore. And in the midst of chapter 3, we get a verse that, if you're familiar with the Bible, you've been around church for a while, you've probably heard before. If not, this is a really neat one. I'm excited to read it to you. But it's a verse that I think a lot of people would forget is in the middle of Lamentations. It's chapter 3, starting in verse 22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Theoretically, that doesn't make sense in the middle of the subject matter that we're dealing with and the horrors that we've already seen described and that we're going to see described more in chapter 4 here in a second. But this is the centerpiece of the book. The God who was consistent enough to carry out this righteous, if very, very painful judgment, will also be consistent enough to follow through on his promise to redeem one way or another. In chapter 4, we get a poem about the contrast between how beautiful things were before and how horrible things were during and after the siege, how everything gets flipped on its head for the worse. And then in the final poem in chapter 5, everyone is begging for God to stop, to relent. to remember his people, to restore what's been destroyed, what's been judged. And then it ends with no resolution whatsoever. And that's it. There's no pat on the head. There's no little glimmer of hope like we get at the end of some other books. The only hopeful thing we see in the whole book is that little bit that I was giving you there in the middle of chapter 3, where the poet considers the character of God. Nowhere in the book does anybody apologize for being sad or being upset. Rather, what we're seeing here is the depths of human despair and grief, and an earnest processing, in this case, of a calamity that was entirely predictable and entirely makes sense to the author. This isn't like Job, where it's like, why did this happen? What's going on? I don't understand. No, here, everybody knows exactly why this went wrong, and we get a great look at a deeply honest human response to that pain, mingled with some top-notch theology about the character of God, even against the backdrop of that pain. When you visualize Lamentations, picture somebody in the dirt of the ruined city of Jerusalem with the ruined temple in the background as they cry out to God. When you consider the theme, think of grief in the context of God. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure you at least read chapter 3. Tomorrow we're on to Ezekiel. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.